Good evening, everyone. Today is February 15th, 2016, and welcome back to Veterans Voices, a monthly talk show focusing on veterans issues. I'm your host, Kevin Graves. Nathan Johnson isn't with us tonight, but we look forward to seeing him again live here in March. Tonight, I'm joined by my co-host and Army veteran, Lindsay Rousseau. Lindsay is part of our production team and also hosted one of our most important episodes, Women in the Military. Welcome back, Lindsay.
Thanks, Kevin. Our episode tonight is called The War After the War. We will be discussing an aspect of trauma that's very real, an invisible wound of war. Moral injury is the crisis of conscience that happens when people do things or witness an act that goes against their beliefs and their moral foundation.
Talking about moral injury is difficult, but your participation is key to tonight's discussion. Are you a veteran with a moral injury? What is your story? Are you a family member of a veteran suffering from a moral injury? What does this topic mean to you? We are broadcasting live, and we'll be taking your calls, emails, and chats. When you call, you have the option to withhold your name. Any chats sent from our website are anonymous.
So call or write in at any time during tonight's show. Now, we'd like to introduce a panel of veterans and experts who are intimately familiar with our topic tonight. So welcome, all of you. Let's just take a moment to briefly introduce yourself and your background relating to moral injury. So let's start with you, Shauna.
Okay, I'm Dr. Shauna Springer, and I'm here representing not the VA, but just myself as a practicing psychologist. I've worked at the VA for the past 7 years, but I've also worked with patients struggling with moral injury in a variety of settings.
Mike Ergo. I was in the Marine Corps from 2001 to 2005, deployed to Iraq twice, and afterwards became a social worker, and I'm a readjustment counselor working with veterans today.
Fantastic.
Stuart Dinwiddie, Army, 94 to 2004, deployed to Operation Iraqi Freedom 1 with the 82nd Airborne, and I'm a veteran who's concerned about other veterans, and having experienced some of the things, the challenges that this topic brings forward, I've seen this in myself and in other people, and I'm passionate about going on that path toward healing.
My name is Fred Tuttle. I'm a Vietnam vet, Marine Corps retired, medically retired, served in combat in Vietnam. But now I serve as a clinical chaplain. I'm working with individuals who are coming back from places of trauma and places of war who are dealing with moral injury, and so trying to help them work through those issues that they're dealing with.
So some of our viewers tonight might not be familiar about kind of what moral injury is and how it differs from PTSD. So why don't we jump off and kind of discuss the difference between the two?
Okay, well, I think there is some common symptom overlap between both conditions. But I think when we boil it down, moral injury is about a feeling of I am unclean and worthy of shame. And I think that's very different from PTSD because at its essence, I think of PTSD, it's an anxiety disorder where a person feels profoundly unsafe and like they can't afford to let down their guard. To trust others, to trust the world to be a safe place, and to trust themselves. And so when you think about trust in yourself, we can see how that can kind of blend into this concept of moral injury, of things that we might have done that were against our own moral beliefs. But they are two separate things. You can have one or the other or both.
And I think not just the spirit of being unclean or unworthy, if you will. I think there's an extreme sense of guilt that goes along with that, and it ties in, and that guilt is what is like the anchor that brings folks down. And so in order to work past that guilt and realize that you can accept yourself, or you can accept what you've done, what you haven't done, what you've seen, what you haven't seen, that comes back to your identity. And in that identity, I feel it's a wound of the identity, as many people have written about, and in the past it's been put under PTSD, and now it sounds like we're breaking out of that and identifying it as a moral injury.
Yeah, it's unique in a lot of ways because each of us bring our own set of values as we enter the military, and when we see things or experience things, partake in things that go against those values, then we're left with this crisis of conscience, like you mentioned, and left to reconcile what that means to who we are as a person.
And I think that one of the other things that that occurred, and it occurred to one of my friends who served in Vietnam. I met with him. I went to see him about 6 months ago. And one of the things that I didn't realize he was dealing with was the guilt of not prohibiting something to happen. He wasn't even sure that it happened, but the very thought that it might have happened, and he didn't stop it as a squad leader, has literally crippled him for the last 40 years.
There's so many different ways it comes about. You're right. Is something you did, something you didn't do, something that might have happened, and you just sparked a memory of mine of witnessing. I was ready for combat, but what I wasn't ready for was to see how it affected the civilian population. And as part of my second tour, my job was to speak with the local people and ask what they needed in terms of medical supplies or doctors or roads getting rebuilt, so I could relay that back to the people on base. And even though I was able to take down that information and bring it to the people who I was supposed to give it to, they essentially told me, well, there's nothing we can really do at this time for these people. And that was something that really didn't sit right with me. At the time I had to kind of stuff it down, but it was something that I just wasn't prepared for, to see the people there waiting, for our help that I was unable to help.
Mike, you bring up something. It sparked a memory for me as well. I had much of a similar mission of rebuilding and nation building, bringing electricity back, food, water, and all that. And people would come to us and ask us for help, and we did everything we could. And yet, we come to find out that many people weren't trusting to come forward, not because we were Americans, but because there were other forces in country in Iraq who were threatening them, saying, if you work with Americans, you will die. And that really, it made me feel almost helpless, other than to say, you can trust us, we will protect you. But there were times when we couldn't adequately protect them, and some people didn't make it.
Yeah, and as I look at it now, my values of helping people and service, which led me to join the Marine Corps and to be a leader in the service, it was conflicting with what I saw of being unable to help and seeing people suffer. And so I didn't know it at the time, but I just knew that something wasn't right. And as I came back home, I took that with me and I took it very personally. Even though there's really nothing as an individual I could have done, I still was unable to forgive myself for that. And ultimately it affected a lot of my relationships with people, reflected my performance in school, at work. And so it's interesting to see how maybe one thing could have such an effect over time on not just myself, but the people I was around, who I care about, and back home too.
There's this link, it seems, between maybe a feeling of helplessness and being morally contaminated, maybe receiving bad orders, partial orders, not being able to help someone. And then what it can do is cause a person to really pull away from community and really isolate, I think. And that is a core part of moral injury. It also can be a part of post-traumatic stress disorder, that people can withdraw from others. But I think more in the case of moral injury, it's that withdrawal, and I'm not deserving of being in community or being, with the friends or the people that I had been formerly associated or accepted by.
And that couples directly with the idea of identity and that loss of identity. Many veterans that I've spoken to in the past have said, before I went off to war, I was this way, why can't I be that way now? And they don't understand that, and so they withdraw. Right. They know there's something different. They know that something has changed. Their identity has changed, and part of your identity, actually, before you go into combat, is that of a warrior, because that's what you're trained to do. But when you come out and then you leave and you go into the civilian sector, or if you're just back in peacetime mode, that identity is completely changed, and you start to wonder and question, what is my identity? And therefore you lose the confidence, and you don't feel you can trust.
And I think one of the issues that has happened, particularly over the last couple of conflicts, is that we have seen more individuals dealing with moral injury and PTSD, and I think in part because we have more combatants that are a bit older than what was in the past. Vietnam era, the combatants were very young, much younger, and were taught to do certain things and didn't really think that much about it, perhaps until 40 years later. I'm dealing with Vietnam vets who are finally coming to grips with what they did 40 years ago. Whereas in the past conflicts, the recent conflicts, many of the combatants are much older, so their moral compass seemed to kick in a little sooner than the Vietnam vets. And so I've seen more individuals coming back now who are dealing with this whole issue of moral injury much sooner than I've seen in the past.
That's really interesting. My heart really goes out to Vietnam vets in particular, because the amount of shame that we're talking about and guilt and helplessness all forms this toxic formula for holding it to oneself, for locking it down. And so Vietnam vets in particular, like you, I've seen coming in more recently. As they retire, maybe life slows down, and some of the demons that were there are kind of finding them now in retirement. One of my favorite groups that I used to do but haven't done recently was a 6-month-long group where we formed a small group, and I tried to pick a good unit of people that would operate like a unit, and then we wrote and we read letters to people in the group of people that we had lost or left behind, or these moral injuries were the stuff of the group, and it was all Vietnam combat trauma vets, and that was such a powerful way for them to connect with each other, again, in that kind of community format, which I think is so important to this.
Yeah, Vietnam vets have been very good at taking on another project. And what happens when one retires from a job, being busy all of the time, and suddenly they are not busy, there's not another project that they can deal with except themselves. They become the project, and therein lies part of the difficulty. And then often the health is failing, it's beginning to fail, and so there's some medical issues. So the combination of that sometimes really can derail the veteran and certainly have an effect upon the family unit.
This is some great information you guys are putting out there, and I want to encourage our audience to please call in or email or chat with us. Give us your perspective on what's on tonight's subject. We have a lot more information to disseminate here, but I think this would be a good time for us to take a look at a video of another gentleman who's gone through the same thing and get a different perspective.
As millions of American men and women return from serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're heading home with more than just the physical scars of war. Science and society have both come to recognize PTSD as a lasting trauma affecting veterans. But a different, less understood condition may be the signature wound felt by this generation of servicemen and women. And it's called moral injury, the psychological damage that troops face when their actions at war contradict their moral codes. Do you feel like you were prepared morally when you were going abroad and into war?
I'm not in agreement with the statement that as prepared as you can be, as morally equipped or as well trained as you are, there are going to be situations where you're going to be faced with the moral quandary. For example, in my personal experience, we were in a firefight where the Taliban were shooting at our forward operating base. And I saw a man running through a tree line and what looked like a weapon in his hands. And we were taking fire from that direction. So I lit into him with a machine gun, and I saw him drop, and the local farmers wheeled him up to our base and told me that he was a farmer. And there I was trying to protect my fellow Marines, trying to stop people from shooting at our base. I saw what I believed at the time to be an enemy. The best of my training, the best of my skills, the best of my experience in Afghanistan, I believed him to be an enemy. And when I killed him, I realized that I'd killed, an innocent civilian, or I was told that he was. Now, even to this day, I don't know whether he was innocent or not. Maybe he was in the Taliban and I was lied to, but the reality of war is that there are situations that you're presented with that you have to tackle as a 19, 20-year-old man or woman that, you know, don't fit into a black and white moral code. They can't easily be labeled as right or wrong. And that can be difficult to deal with when you came home. For me, it was difficult to deal with the fact that I didn't feel anything about that. I knew that I should feel guilt about that, but I didn't, and I struggled with that for a long time. And those are the situations I believe David is talking about. As well trained as you can be, you're still going to have to face situations in which there is almost no right or wrong at that split second. You've got to make a decision, and you have to live with that decision for the rest of your life.
And for you, was that something that hit you immediately after, you know, when you did see the body? Did you start thinking about what you had done then, or did it take a little longer? Did it really start hitting once you got home and once you were no longer there in the theater of war?
I can't say, honestly, because I feel like it has yet to hit me. And that's troubling because I wonder what I've got inside of me, or, you know, it's kind of locked inside of me or something. But I remember we were leaving to go on a patrol as they wheeled his body up. And I looked down at him and saw what I had done. And I'm not sure to this day how I feel about it. Because at the time, I believed in that decision. I believed that that was the right thing to do. I thought he was a combatant. You know, he was running. We were taking fire from that direction. We were always getting shot at from that direction. I did what I thought was right at the time. But now I have to live with it. So it is difficult, but I think that's the reality of war, is that as black and white as we try and make it with the rhetoric, or black and white as we try and make it before we leave for war, it's always going to be a morally ambiguous situation on the ground sometimes. The guilt that we've talked about, I've felt that. The responsibility to live life to the fullest in order to accommodate for those that aren't there is something that I feel every day. And it's a very difficult process. It is.
And we'd like to thank the Huffington Post for allowing us to share that really impactful video. He brought up a lot of really good issues. I mean, you know, kind of since World War II, we've had wars and conflicts where the enemy is everywhere and you can't identify. They're not necessarily wearing a uniform, so you can't tell, you know, who is friend, who is foe. And this idea of, you know, you brought up earlier, the impact of the war on civilians, and how do you process that where you can't tell, you know, is this person an enemy or not? And, you know, how do I work through those types of issues internally?
Well, there's one thing that really resonated with me in that Marine story, was that you have a split second or sometimes less to make decisions. As service people, we're taught to react according to the drills we're taught. So there's not a lot of room for decision making in those instances where it's life or death. And so 1 second or one decision can cause a lifetime of second guessing and playing Monday morning quarterback, or playing it over and over in one's mind to see, could I have done something better?
So the training works out really well for the initial conflict that you're involved with and what you're supposed to do from an aggressive standpoint, but there's really no training that comes into play for what happens next. And that, I think, leaves this void where the chaplaincy corps or clinicians can try to work one-on-one with individuals to try to understand that. And, you know, I was born and raised in a Christian family. We had the 10 Commandments, you know, beat into our heads. And yet, when you join the military, as my son did, and as you folks have done, you have to go against what you've learned to be how you're supposed to treat a fellow human being. And that conflict can last for so long. And I want to go back to the Vietnam era for a moment and ask the question, do you think the stigma that went along with the Vietnam War made it more difficult to deal with the moral injury? Because you were talking about how our troops of today seem to be able to identify with it, get a quicker grasp on it. But do you think that the social stigma that went along with the Vietnam War inhibited maybe some of that ability to see the moral injury?
Well, I think it did. I think the times were very different. The awareness of things that happened to individuals within the war was not as evident back then as it is now. And that's one of the issues. But one of the issues, just moving from the Vietnam era to where we are now, combatants used to be those individuals who carried rifles. The theater has changed.
Yeah, tremendously.
The theater has changed, so if you're in country, you are likely to become a combatant, a truck driver. Many of them that I talk to now, they are dealing with the fact that when they were told to go someplace, they were told to not stop for anyone. If someone jumped out in front of them, they were to run over them.
Right.
And so that creates a dilemma for them once they get back. For many of my young men and even some of my young women, difficulty even embracing their own children now because of what they think they might have done. They don't even know if they killed anyone, but the possibility of having done. But certainly getting back to the Vietnam era, I think that the awareness of and some of the things that we are trying to do for our men and women is much more available now than it was back during Vietnam.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. So what are some of the things that are available now? I mean, how are we approaching helping the service members who are dealing with these types of moral injuries?
I'm glad you asked that question because from a personal standpoint, when I came back in 2004 and rejoined the civilian populace, it wasn't until 2007 I knew there was something off within me. I didn't know why I was acting certain ways, why I was getting mad at certain things where in the past it would never have affected me. And it really was funny. Quick anecdote is one day I saw Mike Ergo on BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, on a train, and he was wearing a Cal Veterans shirt. And I had gone to Cal, and I said, well, what's Cal Veterans? And he said, well, it's this group of veterans who are at Cal, and it wasn't there when I was there. And he said, we're having an informational thing on PTSD. Why don't you come and listen? And so I said, okay, fine. So I went. I thought it might be interesting. And I met Nathan Johnson, who's not here tonight, and he was talking about it. And I found out there's this thing called the Vet Center, which everybody had heard about the VA. When you leave the military, they're like, oh yeah, go apply for VA benefits, and that's where they leave you. And you're left on your own devices. But Nathan explained what the Vet Center, which is part of the VA, but it's more of it's less hospital-like. It's more of a community-based, if you will. And the support groups that go along with it. And I got into it, the Global War on Terrorism group, and every Monday night we'd go and have dinner together and we'd talk through things. And that's where the healing began, was to be able to talk with each other in a community, in a safe environment. And so that's one very important resource I think everybody should understand is out there and available, is the Vet Center.
So from a clinician standpoint, both as a social worker and a psychologist, what are some strategies that you utilize to help people work through these types of injuries, and perhaps things that people can seek out help for, or even maybe do on their own at home? How are you guys approaching these?
Well, normalizing these experiences is one thing. Well, first, validating that, yes, they do affect you because you're a human being who has empathy is really empowering to people. And two, letting these other veterans know that, yeah, it's affecting you because, well, you have these certain values, and being able to let them know that there's a lot of other veterans who feel the same way. And so they're not the only one. And I think one of the shame we face as a country was not allowing a lot of our Vietnam vets to do that. It's a lot easier now for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, thankfully, because we have not only social media and texting and the support of our Vietnam vets who are welcoming us back, but we're able to more readily talk with each other. And so at least letting another human being in and talking and saying, okay, I feel this way, and maybe experiencing the fact that they feel the same way takes it off one's shoulders of being the only person.
I think I'd like to address that question by talking about what doesn't work.
Yeah.
I think what doesn't work is when you sit down with a patient and you say it was, you know, the strain you were under, you were starving, you were suffering with heat stroke, you were, you know, jungle rot on your feet, whatever it is, it's condescending, I think, when clinicians try to explain it away because of the conditions of war. I think it's very important as a clinician to approach it with the humility of understanding that you might not be the target that the veteran needs to find to start the healing process, but you can help people understand where the pain is, where the suffering is, who they're angry at, whether themselves, a commanding officer, who they don't trust, whether themselves, other people, the government. And then you can sometimes facilitate community experiences. I think I'll give an example, other than the sort of Vietnam Vets group, which was a very powerful clinical experience. Sometimes I've worked with people to come together on their private mission work to help restore themselves to a sense of dignity and honor. So one of the vets I've been working with that I've really come to respect, we've worked on this mission that he has of connecting, he's a Vietnam vet, with his fallen Vietnam veteran brothers' families. And he makes a life of this. He goes out to different states where these families live, and he tells them how their loved ones, how they were when he served with them, and how they passed, which many people don't even really know the details of. And so he helps work with these families and helps heal their hearts, and they go and they visit the gravesite and they honor that fallen brother together. And by doing this private mission, he's able to connect with community. So I'm not the source of the healing, I'm just somebody that kind of helps him define what is going to be his next mission to get reintegrated into his community.
It's interesting you say that, because the thought comes to mind is that his healing is coming from helping others heal, and it resonates with me in the Gold Star community, because whenever I can work with another family that's going through the grieving process, I kind of jokingly say to myself, the joke's on them. I'm the one that's getting the healing here, although it's beneficial to them. It's a bilateral thing. It goes back and forth. I get healing from helping other people heal. The same thing you're saying with the Vietnam vet that you were referring to. I think I want to talk more about how it affects the family, but I think we have another video that we want to see now.
Because we've done a good point of explaining that moral injury is spanning the generations,
right,
from Vietnam vets to the current war. So.
And we've used, in the past, they used terms like battle fatigue or war strain or shell shock, but ultimately it's the same thing. The combat stress reactions in the past and what we called moral injury is what we call moral injury today. Our next video is from the Rossmore Veterans History Project, and veterans from World War II, local veterans right here that we went out and got film of, and we'd like to have you enjoy this.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about war and about the military in general?
Oh yeah, I feel that you know, wars are terrible. Like they say, war is hell, and we lose a lot of good young people in those things. And I feel that you know, you got to talk to your enemies more than fight them. You know.
In a way, I like to have more people understand that what the war is. You know, war is not the thing that you just sit there and when you're pointing guns at each other, somebody's going to get hurt.
That's
I
right.
mean, it's just, to me, my children, naturally, they know more or less a little bit more because of their father, but other people, they don't know what December the 7th means, what happened out in the Pacific.
I had some questions about the Almighty in this whole picture. So there were prayer meetings downstairs, and I do remember that we went down to this, to be with this chaplain, put it that way. And he had a different theology than I now possess, but I didn't have a theology then. I will never forget, and sometimes I wake up listening to this, now hear this, now hear this, all hands prepare to abandon ship. And these folk had no choice but to try to get the boats down and get over there. And I think it was something like 230 some people in the company, and there were only about 20 people who made it. The rest of them didn't make it.
Rat-a-tat-tat, a machine gun fired right at my feet, inches away. Instinctively, I took a few steps forward and fell into a wonderful big hole that was there. Now I was panting, sweating, scared, shivering. I felt really miserable, and I'm sure this has happened to a lot of other people, but I was just shaking for a while. But in 10 minutes or so, I got over this and started figuring out what we do next. In this same hole were two other Marines. One was dead, and the other one was just as scared as I was.
And that's a story in itself, as the transition from one moment of being a peacetime soldier to the next moment being a soldier at war. And the transition is very, very painful. But then finally a Focke-Wulf came in, Focke-Wulf 190, and took out engine number 2. And it was time to leave. I was taught that if you wanted to survive, you better delay your parachute opening, because the civilians hated us with a passion. They hated us more than the military, and we would be shot in the air. And
the German civilians?
The German civilians would shoot at parachutes coming down. So the idea was to delay your parachute opening. You just fall, free fall for a while, which is what a good soldier that I was. That's what I did. And at that point, we discovered underneath the landing strip, the Russians went over it with minesweepers to see that it's safe to land planes, and they found dungeons underneath with prisoners, civilian prisoners, Poles, Jews, communists, people that were not in favor of the Nazis, and they were more dead than they were alive.
Oh, wow.
And the Russians marched us through, those who wanted to go, and come and see what Nazis do. I marched through it and got sick to my stomach.
So that was a really incredibly powerful video, and it just reminds all of us how the effects of war are more or less the same and not dependent on age or, where you served. So we just got, some examples from some World War II vets, and one of the issues that was brought up is how World War II vets, Korea War vets, didn't necessarily talk about what they experienced, what they saw, even though for them it might have been, okay, this is a very obvious enemy. So when we got to the era of the Vietnam vet, there was kind of already this history of you don't discuss the things that you experienced, the things that you felt, and how that maybe has impacted how people are coping with moral injury and all the way up to the current conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think it certainly can, but I think clinicians can have an impact upon how one interact with veterans. To give you a good example, I do assessments of men coming into the post-traumatic stress center, and a couple of things I do. Number one, I thank them for their service, and I welcome them to the center, and I tell them that I would be more concerned about them having done some of the things that they had done and seen if they were not bothered by some of those things. Because if they were that cold toward the incident, often it makes one cold toward relationships. And so I thank them for having the courage to come forward and to say, I need some help. And to let them know that they are in a safe environment with other men and women who are also dealing with some of the same issues, and being able to deal with them as individuals and not put them in a box and into a category, but allowing them to talk and really just being a presence with them and letting them talk about and begin to develop their own medical plan in conjunction with some feedback from me, but really allowing them to talk about their experience, what it has done to them, and what it means to them to be in the place where they are in terms of reaching out to ask for help.
So Mike, you had brought up this idea of reconnecting with your values. Yes. So that's something that you have some experience working with veterans on.
Yeah, and when I work with people, I try to draw from my own experience, which is very handy since I got a lot of help when I come back from counselors, specifically at the Contra Vet Center. And when I was in Iraq, I had to shut off my feelings for the most part to survive, to complete the mission. And coming back, sort of that stoicism or that lack of feeling did not serve me as well to really live a full life. And I realized that I was trying to avoid feeling a lot of guilt, feeling a lot of loss and grief, and the things that I saw or partook in that didn't agree with my morals, my values. And so I had to come to a point where I had to forgive myself for those things. In order to be a good husband, to be a father, to be a family member, mm-hmm. I was ineffective if I couldn't do that. Mm-hmm. And when I was able to hear that from a counselor, that the process of forgiving myself was vital to serving other people, I took that on because it wasn't just a selfish thing anymore. So that forgiveness of self and connecting to things. And I had felt a lot of guilt about a time in Iraq where I had a friend clear a house that I'd previously cleared a few different times, but he went in that house and he was killed. And there was nothing I really could have done to prevent that, but I took it so personally. And I was avoiding feeling that, and I didn't want to have anything to do with feeling anything ever again, really. But through the act of self-forgiveness, I was able to say, you know what, my value was and still is to share what a special person this was, my friend Brad, and to let the families know that he's not forgotten, and let the community here know that he's not forgotten, along with my other friends and Marines who were killed. And so I decided that my value was to share that, and so I decided to take that on by running triathlons, racing, and honoring them by putting their names on my jersey. Mm-hmm. And that was a way where I could actively and in a workable, healthy way cope with these things and be able to forgive myself by doing this.
And I think what goes along with that, at least for me, is I like to use the analogy of a garage. And you see and you experience certain things, and you put them in boxes because at that time when mission dictates, mm-hmm. you don't have time to process it. You put it in a box, you throw it in the garage. The issue is that garage isn't an infinite space. So after time, that garage door is going to start creeping open, and you're going to have to look at that and process that, and you can't just keep that stoicism, that hard shield, if you will, up forever, because like you said, you don't interact with society, the people you love, the people who love you the way that you want to, that you know somewhere deep down you know it's not there. So once you start opening up those boxes and looking at it and forgiving yourself, forgiving other people, looking at it and saying, okay, this happened, and acknowledging it, that's where you start opening not only those boxes but yourself up.
Correct.
I have an example of how hard this forgiveness for self is that I'd like to share from a veteran who's given me permission to share it. I'm not going to say anything about his identity or his name. I'll keep that anonymous. But I think the point I want to make is that moral injury can also encompass a murderous rage. We've been talking about these ideas of, you know, couldn't do something to help someone, or feeling perhaps a variant of survivor's guilt for coming back when others you love don't. And in my groups, as I said, we do a lot of writing and processing that way. So I'll just read a couple of excerpts. He was a Vietnam veteran, and he basically was in the back of a truck and he shot a civilian for no reason other than that he was in a state of murderous rage. And that's how he understands the act, and that's how he is processing it. He talks about, all I know is I have sunk into a severely low state as a human being. The sorrow and guilt I have felt these past 40 years for this murderous act has been expertly masked behind memories and wounds of pain and horror. May I share with you, now he's writing to the victim of this act of rage, may I share with you what brought me to this moment of such blinding hate and frustration. And then he talks about all these missions gone horribly wrong, about, you know, having a buddy who lost, you know, his head, or someone holding his right arm with his left arm to keep it from falling off, or having to sit on the body of a brother in a medevac chopper because there's nowhere else to sit. And then he summarizes, the list goes on, so much pain and helplessness. To stop the madness, it all just boiled up in me and I exploded. You represented the entire war to me. You had taken my friends who were genuinely trying to help you and set your people free. You had robbed me of any remnant of clear morality or conscience, effectively imprisoned me, and stolen any innocence or youth which might have remained. I only came over there to help. I do remember and think of you often. You guide me, and I pray that God gives your family some peace. I am so sorry. My God has forgiven me, and what I need now is to forgive myself. And that's what we've been addressing. And so I think it's not just those acts that we wish perhaps we hadn't done or couldn't have prevented, but things that we own that we did in combat that later come to really haunt.
Well, we had another,
people.
We actually just got an email from Dennis, who's also a Vietnam vet, who mentions exactly what you're saying, guilt, that the simple answer to the question of moral injury, it's common for people to attempt to rationalize this guilt away by feeling that this is a terrible thing that I've done and I must live with this guilt every day of my life for the rest of my life. I think this may help some people. I wish it helped me. I look at my actions, both direct and indirect, with a simple view of reality. I was taught not to kill people, but I killed people anyway, and I feel guilt for doing it. So, yeah, exactly like you're mentioning.
I think what I keep hearing in your discussions is that it's such an individual and unique thing. There is not one single answer that's going to address these issues with everybody. We know from, I know from dealing with friends of my sons that everybody has different coping skills. Everybody has different history. Everybody grew up with different values in different families, and some deal with it differently than others, more successfully than others. I don't want to say better because they're, but more successfully than others. They're able to maybe reintegrate into society a little bit easier. And I think we have some great tools that are offered through a lot of different resources in the area that help that reintegration process. And I am hoping that tonight in this discussion, we will be doing the same thing for our audience. And again, we would encourage our audience to call in, to chat with us, to leave us an email. We'd love to hear from you or any of the family members that have any questions. You are the reason that we have this show. So input from you is important to us.
You know, there's a saying that it takes a village to raise a child. It really takes a village to heal the wounds of someone who's been injured as a result of trauma. It really takes a group of folks to deal with them, because as you said, you talk about individuals. The rage that the veteran talked about. For me, the rage was something that I got over quickly. For some, the rage still remains. And so, because we are so different in how we do it, so I think it does take just a group of folk working with our men and women who are coming back. So that's one of the reasons I so appreciate what all of you do, you know, because it is so critically vital for our men and women coming back in order for them to live, to have some sense of normalcy to their lives.
And there's a big spiritual issue here that a lot of people have to deal with depending on your background also, not just a societal issue.
Yeah.
You know, you know, you're taught to love one another, you know.
Yeah.
Love us as in my belief, as Christ would love me. And so there's a spiritual value that has been, a line that has been crossed for a lot of people that contributes, I think, to the struggle.
Absolutely. I received a page, this was back in 2005, I received a page from a social worker. They said there was a veteran in the chapel, and they asked if I could go and see him. And I went to the chapel, and he was there sitting in the back of the chapel. He was sobbing. We knew each other. And I went to him and I said, hey, what's going on? He said, Chaplain, he said, the Bible said not to kill. I've killed people. And he was just sobbing. And so just sitting with him and talking, and number one, letting him cry, and then being able to talk to him and to begin a process of processing all of this, because it is a process. It's not something that you can just say, well, God forgives you. No, it's a process. You have to really work with men and women. So and it does take time. It takes time. And it also, not only for the clinician, I think it's important for those men and women to connect with some of their comrades so that they can really validate and say, hey, you know what, he's dealing with the same thing that I'm dealing with. We had a sergeant major in the PTSD clinic 6 weeks ago. And when I met him, I congratulated him for, number one, for coming forward. I said, you don't know what this means to a lot of these young veterans here, to see a sergeant major coming to say that I need some help. I said, this is invaluable. We had a medical doctor who just left about 2 weeks ago. These are kinds of things that are very important. So not only clinician, but the peer-to-peer is such a helpful tool to
It's probably extremely important, Mike. You deal with that a lot, the vet-to-vet model.
That's the thing is that, like Dr. Springer was saying, that sometimes it's not just clinicians or therapists or doctors helping, but it's the importance, like the first sergeant said, of your peers, of other people who are there with you. And I work with a lot of vets today who tell me how powerful the reunions for their units are. And they'll go back and meet together. And the interesting thing I hear consistently about these reunions is usually it's not necessarily all the bloody war stories that are told, but about what they're doing today, about their kids. And so it gives them a sense of, hey, this is the life after the war. These are the bodies, these are the values that I embody now with my life. And it helps bring a sense of normalcy to all that and a sense of connection with other people.
I want to return to something we said earlier about World War II veterans, Korean veterans, perhaps not talking as much with each other, so that when we got to Vietnam veterans, you know, that was sort of laid in stone a bit. They did and they didn't. I think that one thing that was different and important to point out here in this context is the individual rotation of members in the Vietnam War. Not so much the practice of training people as a unit, serving as a unit, building that cohesion, building that trust in each other, and then frankly having a lot of long boat rides, you know, on you know, coming across the ocean where they could debrief. And I think in a perfect world, the best target group would be the people that served where you did, with whom you served, in what condition you served, and bringing those people together is something that is not a new idea. The ancient, you know, Israeli population, the Zulus, the Native Americans, they all had significant healing rituals that they went through as warriors in community to purify themselves before returning back to community. And that's something we don't do. And so if, you know, in a perfect world, we would have those people with the people they serve with. And what we do is we try to create, as clinicians and as, you know, chaplains, and we try to create community and give people community where they are.
And I think that's something that also perhaps that this current generation of veterans did have, is that I know at least for myself, and it sounds like you guys too, you trained with your unit, you deployed with your unit, you came back with your unit, and you know, this idea of, you know, you were with your unit for the majority of your time in service, and so you were saying like reunions and getting together and being able to process it. It seems like that's something that kind of organically happened with the nature of the current conflicts, and that you do have these people that you served with that you can continue to maintain relationships with beyond your time in service. And like you said, even if it's getting together and just talking about what your kids are doing, or, you know, what your latest job is. And
I think it's important too to have the person-to-person contact. One of the nice things about today is that we can readily access, you know, other people via text messaging and the internet, but we don't get that same human interaction. And since most of our communication isn't verbal, it's nonverbal through our, you know, body language, our posture, our facial expressions, that is lost today when we're talking on Facebook or what have you. And so being able to sit with another person and really be with them, I believe, is the most powerful thing.
But on the other side, I guess, on the flip side of that would be, you're able to more readily identify the fact that there are other people out there who are feeling these same, kind of like, you know, the Vietnam generation, any of these pre-digital generations could very much easily feel like they're isolated in a bubble. And now we can find these resources easier, but then, like you said, getting to that next step of sitting down and talking to someone in person, you know.
And it may not even be the people, like, I think I see the benefit of having trained as a unit, going in and then leaving a war zone as a unit, but then coming back into civilian society. That's where I mentioned that Global War on Terrorism group on Mondays, just being able to sit down with other Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who weren't exactly at the same place at the same time, but we have a common experience. That was so powerful to do it interpersonally and to be able to discuss that, and it's just bring it up in like I said, that safe environment where your family cannot understand and will not understand what they try, but it's not their fault. But that's powerful.
And then the willingness to share that with your family is also another issue.
It's daunting.
Yeah.
It's daunting. It's scary.
I mean, do you really want to expose them to what it is that's causing this tremendous amount of agony for you?
Sure.
You know, we all want to protect those we love.
One thing that you reminded me of, Sarah, was that it doesn't necessarily have to be about talking about whatever happened overseas, but some great examples of what I see happening today around our area is there's a vet I know, Ryan, who has a basketball team for vets. And there's a group of vets that meet together to play softball, of which Nathan Johnson is a part of. And that social outlet of being able to work together as a unit, as a team, without necessarily having to go over the blood and guts talk or whatever is the source of the pain, but be able to be connected with other people, I think, is really important for healing.
And aren't you doing a swim from Alcatraz to the mainland, which is kind of like jumping in the bay with sharks and kind of going back into a high adrenaline, you know?
Yes, and that's even though swimming can be pretty individual, it's a challenge as a team that we're putting on this September, and thank you for bringing it up. And it's about overcoming the limits people put in their minds of what they can and can't do. Just like when people come back and say, I can't possibly talk with people, they won't understand me. But be able to be in an environment where people are coping in a healthy way. And not just the event, but we see a lot of the healing occurring after the practices and before, when people talking, oh, hey, were you with this unit? Oh, I saw them here and there, and be able to bond with people again. I think it's a very powerful thing.
So we've naturally already just delved into a lot of the resources that are out there. So
and that's a great segue, guys. A real theme tonight has been veterans coming together. There are very helpful resources out there for you, for the veteran and for the family members. Here are a few that we may have discussed tonight, and a full list will appear on our website. The VA has great counseling for moral injuries and also runs the National Center for PTSD. Check va.gov for behavioral health clinics in your area.
VA vet centers bring veterans closer together and offer counseling services and therapy groups. For instance, the Concord Vet Center has a group called Healing the Wounded Heart, which is specifically for veterans suffering with a moral injury. To contact them or to find a vet center in your area, go to vetcenter.va.gov. The Coming Home Project provides care, support, and education tools for veterans suffering with spiritual injuries and their families. Go to cominghomeproject.net for more information.
This was a great discussion on moral injury tonight. Thank you, Dr. Springer, Mike, Chaplain Tittle, and Sterrett, and thank you to our viewers for sharing in our discussion on moral injury. Stay tuned for some local events in your area. This is Veteran Voices, and thank you for serving.
Thank you.
And this is kind of where we just...